So if you're not familiar, then you also wouldn't know that the lifeblood of the Amazon Dams network is really, it's everybody, but it's really three people, and one of them is Simone Ateriti. One is, of course, Carol Doria, and Ellen A. G. Marquez, our collaborators from Brazil, from UNIR, and from UFT. And the way I got involved was actually, I've told this story probably to most of you, but very, very kind of strange. I had an undergrad who wanted to study in my lab, Kelsey Timpe. Some of you know her. She was so committed, but she didn't have any money. I didn't have any money at the time. I said, just come to the lab, we'll find something, we'll figure something out. Suddenly, Simone and Stephanie and a couple of other people got a seed grant, and they wanted to hire a research assistant. So I said, okay, this is what you should do. You know, she went to Brazil, she wanted to learn more Portuguese, and I said, well, all right, I'm gonna get you this job. So I put it like my best skills, and I said, Simone, let me take you to lunch. I want to tell you about a student. And then before I knew it, she had actually recruited me to be in the Amazon Dams network. So Kelsey did get the job, which is great, and she's made the progress. She'll get her master's next spring. But that's how I got involved in the first place, and it's been a very rewarding experience. I want to just acknowledge Simone when I'm going to give a very broad overview of hydroelectric dam development in the Amazon. And, I don't know, like I was emailing with some of the students last night, like I finished this last night, they were working last night, and sometimes an assignment is the way to learn something. That's, you know, the reason I'm sitting here with you guys is to learn more about this. I learned a lot in the past 24 hours. So if I get something wrong, please someone let me know. All right, so this is the outline. I'm basically going to do some of the basics. What are the major drivers that are sort of initiating dam development in the Amazon? Talk about population, economy, and energy. A bunch of plans out there for development of dams and other infrastructure, to give a pretty brief overview of that. And then just introduce the framework for how planning efforts are then implemented. What is the sort of licensing and decision-making process? And then open up some questions for discussion. So do you guys recognize this figure? Anyone? What's this going on here?
Myra talked about it, right? There was a big protest that she was involved in, and like people like breached the part of the construction site, right?
Yeah, so this is the Belo Monte Dam, right, on the Xingu River. It's therefore very contentious, and so people actually, there's a coffer dam and earthen dam as part of the construction, and as a protest, people breached the dam. So obviously, very contentious issue going on in Brazil. So I just want to give some basics, and we've talked, all semester about the Amazon, about its ecology, about sort of its cultural history, and so some of the stats really help tell the story of why dam development is ongoing. So over 200 million people now in Brazil. And so the growth rate actually kind of echoes a lot of developing to developed nations. In the 60s, about a 3% annual population growth rate, only about 1% right now, and it mirrors a lot of other developed countries like the States. And so you think about the 200 million people, it's a little more than half of the U.S. population, and the two countries' sizes are relatively comparable, especially if you forget about Alaska. So about, similar sizes, but a very geographically uneven distribution of people. So we see along the coast and in the south and in the east, most of the population of Brazil. And it's actually, this number surprised me when I found 85.7% urban population as of 2015. And that is an ongoing process. So about 1.5% a year of population. And large areas that are very sparsely populated. And I really like seeing this figure. This is a night falling on Brazil, and you can see the lights of the populated areas that are lighting up. Of course, there's still sunlight over here, but as the sun sets or as the earth turns, you would see not a lot of urban centers with the exception of Brasilia as you get out. So you get this very uneven, very urban population. Oh, I forgot to say, bom dia, pessoal. Spectre longe, okay? And I'm going to do my best to say in Portuguese for the names of these agencies. So there's people, a lot of people, a growing population. The economy is one of the largest in the world, so it depends who you ask and what numbers you use. It's either 9th or 8th largest economy, projected to be the 6th largest economy by 2030. This graph up here is pretty interesting. These are the world's 20 largest economies. This is the top right. US, China, India, Japan, Germany, Brazil. And so in 2030, expected that Brazil is really going to be the number 6 by GDP economy in the country. So this got me thinking, 200 million people, it's a lot, but it's not that many. So I'll ask you guys out there. You got the GDP is going to be number 6, and growing population, but not huge. GDP per capita. Where do you think Brazil rates on GDP per capita? There's about 200. Check it out. 65? Do I hear 38? 20? No. So of course the undergrad is, not big one. Yes, it's about 75. Okay, so 75th. And you see some of like the oil states in the Mid East that are sort of very high GDP per capita. So the distribution of wealth continues to be an issue in developing as well as in developing. So the economy of Brazil is beginning to be dominated by the service sector. Service sector, 67%, 27% industry, and 5.5% ag. And I didn't really have a good feel for what those words meant, so I just looked up to the U.S. We have this economy dominated by consumer spending and by the service industry. The U.S. has 80% of the economy in the service industry. So Brazil is really showing this trajectory towards, a developed nation where you get industrialization waning relative to things like the service sector. And this is just a nice little map of what Brazil exports. A lot of agricultural products, a lot of mining products, and then some industrial sort of value add. So this is the question: is Brazil's economy, the darling of the modern, the Western world? And in the early 2000s, I mean, if you Google search for darling of, economic darling, you get a lot of hits. Okay, so indeed, in the 2000s, this was the case. From 2000 to 2000 to 2012, a growth rate of 5%, including the global crash of 2008 and 2009, so really kicking along. 2013, 2.5% GDP growth rate, basically zero in 2014, projected to be in recession in 2015. This is a story that people with AI in their pockets are nodding very sadly over there. But it's, indicative of a larger cycle of booming and busting that's happened over decades. It happens in many countries. In Brazil, it's, there are booms in the 80s followed by busts. So we've got this idea there that the economic darling, a developing nation, hugely growing economy, attracting things like the World Cup, attracting things like the Olympics, and of course now the state, currently is very different. We've got the president with an 8% approval rating. Scandals of corruption basically from, across the country. And this graph here from the Pew Research Center only goes back to 2010, but it's showing you're basically asking Brazilians what is their view of the current economic situation in Brazil. So currently 87% bad, 13%. So this is a large trajectory. And this is just setting the stage for the type of population and economic growth that is going to demand this energy infrastructure. All right, so that was the basics about economy, the basics about energy. Okay, energy and economy are linked. This is like the duh hypothesis. Like, of course, we know that economies need energy to grow, and that growing economies grow people, and that people use energy. And so this data is from the World Bank and a variety of sources, but the actual graphs are from Brazil Energy, so take it as you will. But in general, we see that power consumption increasing over time, GDP increasing over time, and we have this link between power consumption and GDP. These are a bunch of countries with GDP on the x-axis, electricity consumption on the y, and you see Brazil here and USA over here. And so there's this general trend of as GDP increases per capita, per capita energy consumption increasing. And in Brazil, we've seen this rise and this race towards both increasing economy and increasing generation, sometimes a little bit out of step or out of phase, not keeping up with each other. Crise de apagão, so blackouts, right, that are rolling through a lot of the large cities in the southeast. So this is a figure from 2009 showing widespread blackouts in Brazil. So we have these linked economy and energy production systems. And so we of course want to understand what is the portfolio, what are the sort of energy assets that Brazil uses. And so when you think about this, or you want to understand this, you find a lot of varying numbers. And one of the reasons is you have to make sure you're asking the right question. So you can ask about energy consumption, and this graph on the left shows energy consumption, and that's across the entire economy. So that includes things like diesel trucks running, that includes things like electricity, it includes basically every element of energy in the economy. And then you've got electricity generation. You've also got a difference between electricity generation and electricity generating capacity. All right, and so this can get a little confusing. You're trying to add up how much energy is being used. I thought of an analogy this morning where, let's say you're out watering your garden, and you have a hose, right? The hose has a rate at which it can put water out. Maybe it's 5 gallons per minute, okay? That's your capacity. That's like your power plant's capacity. But if you turn on the hose for an hour, you know how much water you're going to get. It's less than if you turn on the hose for a day. So when you're understanding energy capacity versus energy generation, capacity is how much that hose can put out, and the generation is how much water you put out. Yeah. Okay, great. So if you know that, then you can look at the capacity. Here's capacity. Fernando Prado estimated using data from ANEEL in 2013. Largely dominated by hydropower, about 70%, about 30% by thermal. That's oil, natural gas, and coal, and then other small sources. All right, and then when we think about projected energy demand, we have to remember the economic projections really dictate what we think about the energy projections. And if we think we're going to have 5% GDP growth year after year, we could expect to have 5% energy consumption growth year after year. And if we're incorrect about one of those assumptions, we're going to be incorrect about the other. So there are a lot of plans looking at how much energy Brazil is going to need in 2020, 2030, and they take into account an assumption about growth. This one is from I think it was published in 2012, and it looks like 4 to 5% year after year growth on both energy production and GDP. We see that's not the case. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that it's not just population, and it's not just economy, but it's standard of living. And as basically the economy is able to support a larger middle class, energy use per capita. So if you're a policymaker in ANEEL, or if you're a politician and you're trying to think about capacity, you got to think about population growth, economic growth, and also this sort of basically social and demographic change that developing to developed countries. All right, so I'm just going to skip this for now. There's a lot of energy that is projected to be needed in 2020. It continues to go up. The projections say we need more, we need more, we need more. And so, what are we going to do about it? The plan is to look for large expansion in hydropower generation in Amazon. And so there are a lot of plans. Starting in I think the 1940s or 50s, there was a plan to sort of convert the Amazon River to a series of locks and Great Lakes. I mean, there are dozens of plans. I don't know what all of them are. I want one take-home message, which is to say that this development in that area that is sparsely populated, we saw from before, that doesn't have the night lights from the satellite. Basically, the energy is directionally moving towards the southeast, and that's not rocket science. This is where the large population centers are: 20 million in Sao Paulo, 12 million in Rio, and so really large cities, and these blackouts are a big social and political issue. So this is kind of the take-home message of the plans. Get the energy and bring it down to the places that are basically in energy and sometimes in water crises. Also, when you're looking for a figure that tells you about where dams are and where dams are going to be in the Amazon, you can find 1,000 figures. And each one is, this one's in construction, this one's planned, these are in one plan or the other. And so I thought it'd be good to show a baseline. These are actual dams in 2002. And so you can see their distribution, a lot of dams on the southeastern coast, few that are sort of spread around the larger Amazon and through the northeast. And then the figure on the bottom right shows the remaining sort of energy generation capacity. This is like the potential. Where can we get more energy? And it's quite clearly concentrated in the Amazon, okay? And so that is where these plans focus. This is the Programa de Acceleración de Crecimiento, started in 2007 under Da Silva. It has been adopted now, and PAC 2 is Dilma Rousseff is investing a lot of money. You think about PAC 1 and PAC 2, about $1 trillion in either invested or planned investments in developing this large network of energy generation and transmission. PAC 2 has 76 dam projects in Brazil. There are sort of regional plans that look for energy generation in the neighboring countries, Peru, Bolivia, Guyana, and Peru. So here's sort of one plan. I mean, the point of this, to take on lots of triangles on the map, right? A ton of planned, and there's completed, in execution, licensed, and in preparation dams there. And then we get even a larger scope, the Initiative for the Integration of the Regional Infrastructure of South America, and this continental scale transformation, taking the Amazon into really like energy production, transport, industrialization. Includes 177 plants either built or in construction, 200 planned, 200 inventory. You add it all up, it's over 600 potential dams, some smaller, some larger, sort of proposed for the Amazon, and 20,000 kilometers of waterways. You could zoom into any one of these and sort of understand what the impacts of a dam or a hydro construction would be, but the scale is unprecedented. And so take home 2 from the plans is this. And this is how we set it in the grant proposal we actually got. So maybe use this one, okay? The rapid pace of plan development, spatial scale of impact, and potential for detrimental and irreversible loss of globally important ecosystem services. It's all the stuff that's going to happen. And it hasn't happened before. Make this impending hydrologic transformation unprecedented. And I put hydrologic in blue because, of course, blue water, but just also to remind me that it's not just a hydrologic transformation. It is an ecological transformation. It's a social and an economic transformation. Everything. All right. We need a lot of energy. We're going to build a lot of dams. How do we do it? So, I've been learning about this kind of slowly, and when I first hear about dam construction in the Amazon and all the protests, I figure it's like going to be the Wild West. There's no framework. Basically robber barons are coming in, destroying the forest. As I learn more and more, there's actually a very sort of developed framework for licensing environmental projects in the Amazon. That's maybe not the biggest problem. So there's a lot of good in environmental licensing. The Programa Nacional de Medio Ambiente, back in '86, started the program of licensing. It was adopted in the Constitution in '88. And kind of like in the US, if you're familiar with US laws, there are federal laws, and then the state may have a stricter environmental law or a different set of standards. So regionally, there are differences in the laws and the application at the state and local levels. And the good part, there's some participation, capacity. So here we have, I'm going to say the name wrong, but Tuira Cayapo, a Cayapo leader, having a public discussion in Brasilia about the Belo Monte Dam with Alexa Papandea. And this picture is worth 10 million words. It's amazing. But indeed, there's a capacity, there's a framework for having public discussion. Now, what happens with this discussion is the next slide, of course, you're going to see is the bad, right? And there are science standards that are used, and science is in quotes, because some of the science is not well known. And some of the sciences, in the US, we have, when you get a degree in biology or ecology and you go work for a consulting firm to facilitate development, we have a word for this person? Bioinstitute. Okay, so I didn't have to say it. Bioinstitute, right? Okay. So anyway, so there's some good, and there's a lot of bad, and this is like synthesizing maybe 10 or 15 slides worth of bad, okay? But I didn't want to go on all day. There's structural bad, there's scientific bad, there's social bad in this process. And I don't really want to go too much into it, but the actual process itself can be difficult. The science is troubling. We don't really have a great idea on the science, and sometimes the science is ethically challenged. And on the social side in particular, the sort of impacts, the way to mitigate is really, really poorly known. And so I'll let you review that. I don't want to get too long, but indeed there's some good stuff in the licensing and a lot of sort of gaps to be filled. And then we have, right, decide that, it doesn't, not just Brazil, this report, Commerce or Corruption, comes from Malaysia. And the idea that corruption, corruption follows money, power, and money are related. It's not a specific or particular thing for Brazil, but indeed we've seen large-scale corruption scandals erupting almost every corner of Brazil political life right now. And, this was talking about your river, about the Madeira River, so San Antonio Jarau Dam. So $5 billion.
This month.
Yeah, no, this is
right
very
now.
fresh. Yeah. So this slide is kind of awful. But so I wanted to set the framework. All right, there's a licensing process. There are goods and there are bads, and this is basically the structure of how it works. And there's this estudo de impacto ambiental, so the environmental impact statement, the environmental impact report, and basic environmental plans. And these are the things that the dam consortia have to put together in order to get their licenses. And the licenses kind of go from a planning through building, mitigating, and monitoring phase. And when you're planning, you develop an environmental impact assessment and then develop a report that goes out to the public. That's great. There's a process. It has, there's almost like a form. The things are huge, 500 pages, but there's a form that these consortia have to go through. It doesn't authorize installation, but what's critical is that at that point, it does approve the design. It approves the location. At that point, if you get through here, and you're likely to get through here, then you're going to get the rest of the way. The momentum carries you far, and that's some of the issues that people have seen is that, yeah, you provide some kind of assessment of the impacts. You even build a basic environmental plan to say how you're going to mitigate them, and you get your license to actually start work. But there's not a lot of follow-through on implementing the mitigation plan and really even understanding if this mitigation plan is sufficient. And it brings, I'm going to have sort of one ending question about mitigation, what it means, and whether it's sort of the appropriate way to address questions of development. So if you get your installation license, then you go into your monitoring phase, and a variety of federal agencies and perhaps local and regional agencies check to see that you're implementing the mitigation that is proposed in the PPA, get your license to operate against. So I don't know how long that was, but I'm hoping it was under 20 minutes. And what I wanted to open discussion for, but we'll probably wait until after the 3 talks. One, just very general. There are obvious pros and cons, and it seems sort of maybe even pedantic to list them, but saying them out loud can sometimes help us, frame where our specific position or how our scientific inquiry can help answer some of these questions. And I wanted to add one more to this discussion, which is to say that I've worked a long time in wetland restoration and mitigation, and often, the idea is that you need to have some sort of service, an economic service, and this wetland is in your way. Maybe it's farming, maybe it's development. So you can destroy it, and you can impact it, and you can build another one elsewhere, or you can mitigate the impact elsewhere. And we find, of course, that you're not getting the same thing back. And so that's the same across ecosystems damage, but it is the same across social systems. And I think as we get more aware that mitigation is maybe, 25% successful, or maybe successful very rarely, we really want to use mitigation as a justification for all impacts. If anything can be mitigated, then you never not do anything. So, but I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Carol.
Thank you.